Alright, here we are, 2 days away from the season premiere of Survivor's greatest ever season. I'm saying that before I've even seen an episode because that's how excited I am for it. It's the 40th season, Winners at War, which, as you can probably guess by the title, is going to pit 20 of the greatest Survivor winners head to head to see who will be crowned the ultimate Survivor champion. Now, I'm making this PowerPoint for my friends. I introduced them to my love of Survivor, my geekiness, with trepidation in my sophomore year of college, with Survivor Season 32, Kerrang. We loved it, we all watched it, I obviously had watched it already, but they all kept up with it for the most part over the last 8 seasons, and going into this year, I struggled to kind of express how big this was, not just for me, but for all Survivor fans who have been there for many, many years, how monumental it feels. And they wanted to understand, they wanted to get it, they wanted to be as excited as I am. So what do I do when I want to convey my deep love for something, my deep and passionate analysis and nerdiness for something? Boom, I make a PowerPoint. So that's what I'm doing here. It's just for a bit of fun, and for the most part it is just for my friends. So although I am going to post this on YouTube and, you know, share it around a little bit, this is really just for my friends, and also maybe for anyone else who has watched a little bit of Survivor, is kind of interested, and just wants kind of a general overview of who is going to be on Season 40 and what it's all about. I'm not going to go into detail. I'm not really going to, you know, try and hunker down into how the game's going to play out. I just want to celebrate the people who are coming back into the season and kind of give a little bit of insight as to why they're here and why I'm excited to see them. So without further ado, let's crack on. Alright, so I've started here. I'm not sure if you'll be able to see it, considering this is a bit of a weird setup, but I've done the tribes. Nice little picture of everybody, some of them cast photos, some of them photos from their everyday lives, and I put the logo of the season they won above or below them, just to kind of denote that all of these people have $1 million in the bank at least from their first stint on Survivor. Of course, the Queen Sandra has 2 logos because she's won twice already. So her motivation is going to be a little interesting because unless she somehow wins for a 3rd time, there is going to be another 2-time winner after this season. And here we're going to start with Amber Mariano. We have not seen Amber in 32 seasons. She was originally on the 2nd season of Survivor all the way back in 2001. She finished 6th place. She was a nice girl, a young college girl, but she wasn't particularly entertaining, and I don't think anybody's going to, you know, chase me down for saying something like that. She was nice, but she wasn't all that, which is why it was quite a surprise when she ended up coming back for Survivor All-Stars a few years later for Season 8. Now, she ends up winning All-Stars. Spoiler alert, I probably should have said that already. You're going to get spoiled in every single season that is represented on this list, but she wins Survivor All-Stars, the first All-Star season of returning players in Survivor history. But what's notable about it is that she didn't just win the show, she met her husband on the show. They formed an alliance on day 1. They went all the way to the final 2 together, with him taking most of the bullets as far as backstabbing and betraying their allies, and she ends up beating him in the final 2, but not before he gets down on one knee and proposes to her. And thus was born the power couple of reality TV. Rob, who I'll talk about in a little bit, but who my friends will have already seen a little bit of if they watched last season, he ends up coming back and winning again, which obviously we'll get to, but he proposes to Amber. They now have 4 children. They both went on The Amazing Race together. Their wedding was televised on CBS. It's kind of hard to imagine nowadays, but it really was a huge deal, and they were a huge power couple back in the day. So just to kind of give you an overview of what I'm going to do for each of these people, just to keep it brief, I'm going to go over the connections they have on the cast, the people that they've played with before. I'm not talking about people who they've met or been friends with, because who knows, I definitely don't. I'm going to go over their style of winner, and really I'm going to talk about whether they're a leader or a follower, whether they're a rigid kind of my way or the highway type player, or if they're really adaptive and go with the flow. And then I'm going to come up with one adjective that I really feel describes their game on the whole and why they won. And then I'm also going to rank them according to threat level. Now, I'm not going to rank them 1 to 20 because that's too difficult. I'm just going to say whether they're a level 1 threat, meaning pretty unthreatening, not many people are going to be after them, a level 2 threat, which Amber is, who is a little bit threatening and definitely has some reasons to be worried going into the season, or a level 3 threat, which is essentially, you know, the biggest target you can possibly imagine, going to be playing from the back to start with. So like I said, Amber is a level 2 threat. She would be a level 1 threat if Boston Rob wasn't also on the show. The fact that she's there with her husband and they both get to play they have double the odds already. Automatic alliance, so yeah, she's a level 2 threat. So moving on. Boston Rob Mariano, couldn't exactly leave this out for too long. He is considered kind of as probably the greatest male player in Survivor history. He's played 4 times, it's the most of anybody in the history of the show. This will be his 5th time playing, which is just mind-boggling to me that he's done it that many times. And he's got a very mixed bag of results. In his first season, he was young, he was about my age, he finished in 10th place, got on the wrong side of the numbers, got booted at the merge. But it was All-Stars, as I mentioned, where he really made his name. He was cutthroat, he was a brilliant strategist, but not the best socially, and ultimately ends up finishing in 2nd place to his future wife, Amber, but he got the girl, so does it really matter? He comes back for what I would consider the first quarter quell of Survivor, which was 10 years ago in Heroes vs. Villains Season 20, and if it wasn't for one mistake by one of his allies, not even by himself, involving a split vote where votes were cast in directions that they shouldn't have been cast in for logical reasons, he probably would have done very, very well in Heroes vs. Villains, but because another guy who we will talk about later kind of screws the pooch on it, he ends up going out in 13th place, and at that point you're thinking, okay, you know, he's not going to win the show. But then, 2 seasons later, very soon afterwards, they essentially created a show and cast a show specifically for him to win. It was him, another guy called Russell, who didn't end up ever winning the show, who he had gone head-to-head with in Heroes vs. Villains, who came back as the captains of their 2 tribes, and they went head-to-head, although they never really played a second on the tribes with each other, because Russell was voted out pretty much straight away. Boston Rob ran the gambit, completely blew everybody out of the water, and it really wasn't fair to begin with, but he got his win and he earned his spot on the season because of it. Now, his connections, obviously he's connected to Amber, he's also connected to Sandra, who we'll get to later, the 2-time winner. They played together in Heroes vs. Villains, and they also mentored people in the Island of the Idols last season and lived together for 36 days without actually playing Survivor, so it'll be interesting to see what that dynamic is like. We've got Tyson, who is the aforementioned guy who kind of screwed the pooch. He also ended up coming back and getting his redemption in a later season, hence why he's here. And then PARVATI Shallow, who we will get to as well, one of the biggest female Survivor winners of all time. They all played together on Heroes vs. Villains, and I do realize now that I'm leaving something out that I forgot. There's another guy, ZOHN, who played a long, long time ago. He also played on All-Stars with Rob, although I struggle to think, I don't think they ever were actually on the same beach in that season, although, fun fact, he did used to date his wife, Amber, before they were married or before they even met, I don't know, but that's a little tidbit for you. So his style, he's definitely a leader. He comes in and he tries to get his numbers and he leads the charge. He's the man riding in front, hence why in a couple of his seasons he's ended up not doing so great, because when you're the leader of your alliance, unless your alliance ends up being the last 4 or 5 people, you usually end up going out pretty early on, so he's definitely a leader type. I would say that the adjective I would pick to describe him is perceptive. That's kind of why he won Survivor, was because he knows how to read people. He's now a poker player. I don't know if he does it professionally, but he certainly does it enough to be very good at it. And he just has that way of reading people's body languages, seeing their tells, and kind of looking behind their eyes and seeing what they're doing. And that's a big part of the reason why he's able to play this game so effectively. He's a rigid kind of player, though. That's one thing that maybe counts against him, is it is very much his way or the highway. You don't see him as the type who's just going to get lumped into anyone else's alliance and go with the flow. He's going to want to lead, and he's going to want to do things his way, which can be beneficial or can be very, very harmful depending on the season. He's obviously a level 3. They built a statue of his head last season and basically gave all of the new players a crash course with him and Sandra on how to play the game. Definitely a level 3 threat. I also, realized I neglected to say that my word for Amber's game, along with being a follower, obviously, to Rob's leadership, and being adaptive to Rob's, rigidness, she's a social player. She won because she was more social than Rob. She managed to get people to like her a little bit more, and that ended up getting her the win when they went one-on-one in the final 2 of All-Stars. So, moving on. Sandra Diaz-Twine. The queen stays queen, or at least she did until about 10-15 days into Game Changers, her most recent appearance on the show. Now, she has the distinction, obviously, of being the only 2-time winner so far. That's most likely going to change for obvious reasons, based solely in the odds of this season. She won her first 2 seasons. Her first season in Pearl Islands, she ended up winning 6-1 vote, I think, at the end. She was, a pretty averagely regarded winner, very forgettable. She really made her legacy in Heroes vs. Villains when, like I said, in the first quarter quell, she was one of these players who was brought back. didn't really seem to make a lot of sense. I don't think people were, upset that she was there, but I don't think people were, pining for her to come back all of that time. So the fact that she ended up coming back and obviously winning the show is a testament not only to how lower threat level people tend to end up winning these all-star seasons, but also a testament to how good her survival instincts are in the game. She was very good, despite being down in the numbers. She was part of Boston Rob's original alliance in that season, which got picked off one by one until she was the only one left, and she managed to just float on by. She convinced Russell, who was kind of running the show that season, that she was an easy person to take to the end, a GOAT, just somebody you could drag there and beat easily. And Russell ended up being the GOAT, and Sandra ended up winning that season. She comes back again in Game Changers, but it just doesn't really fall her way, but not for lack of trying. Her original strategy was very much an anyone but me kind of thing. She'll take the back seat, she'll let everyone else fight it out, and she'll just stick around. In Game Changers, she switched it up a bit. She knew that she had a huge target on her back, so she decided, alright, this time I'm going to come out and I'm going to be guns blazing. And it kind of worked. She really only got voted out because of the tribe swap. She ended up down in the numbers at a tribe swap, and at that point she was the most obvious target from the smaller tribe. But to be honest, if that tribe swap goes her way and she ends up with her people from her original tribe, she very easily could have gone very deep in the game. I don't know if she could have won, but she definitely could have gotten close. So it's very interesting to see her come back. As mentioned before, she has the connections with Rob, TYSON, and PARVATI. We'll talk about TYSON and PARVATI later, but the four of them were all actually on the same starting tribe in Heroes vs. Villains. They were on the Villains tribe together, and Sandra was the one who beat all of them. So PARVATI ultimately came in second place. We'll get into that a little bit later. As far as her game style goes, she's definitely a follower. Anybody but me. She'll be brought into somebody's big alliance, whether it's somebody like Boston Rob on Heroes vs. Villains, or somebody else this season, maybe not Rob, just because they've got a little bit of a different history now, but she is very much the kind of person who's going to be along for the ride, and then she's going to stick around, and just when you think, there's no way she can possibly win, she's still there on day 39, and she's likable enough to get the votes. She's a rigid kind of player, which is odd considering she's an anybody but me kind of player, but she very much is, this is my alliance, these are my people, screw everybody else, which is not an adaptive gameplay strategy. So it'll be interesting to see how that works, especially with all winners, because she's the only one who's won twice, so she automatically has that target on her. But with so many targets out there, it wouldn't be that much of a shock to see her find her way into an alliance and just coast by once again. It all depends with how she approaches the game. The adjective I would use to describe Sandra is sassy. It's a self-professed thing. She calls herself Sassy Sandra. She gives a lot of lip to the people she does not like, and she tells it like it is, and that's why we all love her, and we're very happy to have her back for this season. As far as her threat level goes, she's a 3. She's won twice already. What more do you need to say? And it's peculiar because in none of her other appearances, or at least in her first 2 appearances, she would have been a 1 threat level, because that's kind of how she wins. Nobody really expects her to be there long term. They feel like they can just vote her out whenever, and then they never do, and she beats them in the end. Alright, moving on. TYSON APOSTOL. Now, he's one of my favorites. He's a very interesting kind of guy. He's a Mormon, he was a professional cyclist, but he is so dryly sarcastic, witty, and intelligent in a kind of beach bum kind of way. It's very fascinating to talk about a guy like TYSON. Now, he had a very checkered start to his Survivor career. He was the young, goofy, arrogant guy in his first season in Tocantins in 2009, and he ended up getting voted out in 8th place. His own alliance kind of turned on him, and ultimately he kind of got a little bit too big for his boots. He comes back just a year later in Heroes vs. Villains, and as mentioned before, in one of the most infamously stupid moves, he botches the hell out of a split vote. I'm not going to go into the details of it because it's a little complicated. Essentially, he's in an alliance with Sandra and Rob and a few other people. They have the numbers 6-3 against PARVATI, Russell, and Danielle. They decide to split the votes. There's no way they can lose, right? Well, they can lose if they deliberately, without knowing, somehow manage to conspire a way to lose. TYSON switched his vote. Instead of splitting 3-3, they ended up splitting 4-2, so when the idol came out, the 3 votes of the people on the bottom ended up knocking TYSON out. He deserved it. It was a stupid thing to do, and he would admit that to himself, but he really came back and got his redemption 3 years later when he played Survivor Blood vs. Water. Now, this season was obviously not unique, but was a first at the time where we had 10 returning players along with 10 of their loved ones, whether it be a wife, a mother, a son, a daughter, any kind of relation you can imagine, they were out there. And he came in with his girlfriend at the time, who is now his wife and mother of both of his children, and she was voted out in second, the second person voted out, I should say. And what he does at that point is he uses that as fuel to keep him going. Not that he wasn't already motivated enough to show people that he was good at Survivor. He used that as his momentum to try to carry him through, because that was the only way it was going to be worth it for seeing her voted out, essentially because she was connected to him. They voted her out to get to him. And he ends up doing it. It is a masterful game. He really was spectacularly funny, but also strategic and just generally dominant in a game, but without being so much so that people wanted to vote him out. I mean, he found idols, he played them correctly, and he just had an all-round fantastic game. Now, I didn't think we'd ever see him again after that because he kind of completed his arc, but when a season like Season 40 comes up, as with a lot of these other people, those no's turn into yeses because they want to be a part of this, and I'm really glad to have him here. His connections, I've already mentioned it, Rob, Sandra, and Parvati from Heroes vs. Villains. His style, he's the only one who I'm going to go with on this. I kind of couldn't decide whether he was a leader or a follower, because he's been both. He was a follower to Rob in Heroes vs. Villains, and obviously ended up getting himself voted out by his own stupidity. But then he was a leader in Blood vs. Water, but he was a leader kind of from the second man position. He always wanted to have somebody in front of him until it was too late in the game. So I've named him a hybrid. I kind of copped out on it. He can be either, depending on who he's with, which obviously means he's a very adaptable player. But the adjective to describe his winning game was adaptive, or subversive, I should say. He was subversive in the sense that he kind of came at it from a different angle that nobody had really come at it before. He did subtle little things here and there, and he kind of got inside people's heads and manipulated them, but he didn't do it in an obvious puppet mastery kind of way. He did it in a very uniquely TYSON way. He was a guy who knew his own strengths and played to them very well. Obviously, he had the benefit of having played a couple of times and made mistakes before, so he knew what to change, and he was also playing with a lot of players who had never played before, as well as some returning players who weren't really on his level, to be completely honest. So he was a very subversive player, and for that reason, I give him a threat level of 3 as well. Moving on to Parvati Shallow, one of the most referenced Survivor players of all time. She's always been cast as the flirt. She was a young girl coming into her first season in the Cook Islands in 2006, and she didn't really do a whole lot in that season. It was a controversial season because they divided the tribes into tribes based on race. Yeah, I know that sounds ridiculous. If you're interested, go look it up. It is fascinatingly terrible judgment by Survivor at the time, but she ends up kind of just being there here in a minute. She's a pretty girl. She looked good in a bikini. She got at least a decent amount of airtime, but she didn't do anything overly strategic. So it was a surprise when they brought her back a couple of years later to play on Survivor Fans vs. Favorites. It was the first season where we had half a cast being new players and half the cast being returning players. Now, when she comes into this season, she very narrowly avoids being the first person voted out. One of her former cast members on the Cook Islands was on that tribe too. He said, don't let her fool you, she's dangerous, we've got to get her out. And it looked like that's the way the votes were going to go until another guy kind of went a little crazy and decided he didn't want to be there anymore and essentially quit the game. And that gave her a cop-out, which ended up riding her all the way to the end. Now, she's kind of mischaracterized in a sense that a lot of people look at her Micronesia game, the one she won, and say that's the defining part of her legacy. But ultimately, that was a very alliance-based game in the sense that she was paired with Sari, who's one of my all-time favorites, who unfortunately has never won the game, and another woman called Amanda. And the three of them, along with a couple of other girls that they roped in, really ran the table until they got to the final 3. And ultimately, she was kind of set up to lose. They thought it was going to be a final 3. It was going to be Sari, Parvati, and Amanda, and it's almost unanimous amongst the people who were out there that Sari would have won if it had been a final 3, but they kind of pulled the rug out from under them. It ended up being a final 2. Amanda wins in the final 3 immunity, and tearfully votes Sari out because she knows she can't beat her, and ends up losing anyway to Parvati. So Parvati kind of, although she played very well, lucked into that at the very end. She didn't really have an end game in Micronesia. But then comes Heroes vs. Villains, and for me this is where her legacy was really made. She comes in again with an enormous target on her back. This is just a couple of years after this game that people have been talking about for years at this point, and she immediately is targeted, immediately in the Minority Alliance. As we mentioned before, on the Villains tribe, she was up against Boston Rob, TYSON, Sandra, a few other people. She was very much down in the numbers, but some bold play by herself, and also her alliance partner Russell, who kind of scorched the earth in that season for her. The move that was made involving TYSON kind of voting himself out was done because they wanted to vote Parvati out. They wanted to split the votes between her and Russell. They knew Russell had an idol, so they thought, okay, let's just split the votes, and whoever gets the idol played on them, the other person goes home. But because Russell convinces TYSON that Parvati's the bigger threat and he's going to vote for him, TYSON decides he wants to get Parvati out so bad that he's going to change his vote. Ultimately, Russell then gives Parvati the idol, which you have to say is a testament to how well she bonded and groomed Russell through the whole season. And that ends up sparing her, and from that point, the train kept rolling downhill. She has an amazing move later on in the game where she plays two idols, but neither one for her at the merge vote. She gives one to Sandra and one to her other tribe mate, Jerry. They don't get any votes. They end up knocking off one of the heroes at the merge. They steamroller through to the final five, and from that point on, it seemed like it was Parvati's game, but at the end, she ends up losing by 6 votes to 3 against Sandra because they all hated Russell on the jury, and they kind of lumped Parvati in with Russell. So it's still a topic of debate as to whether Parvati may have deserved to win that game based on gameplay, but ultimately in Survivor, no one who wins doesn't deserve it because it is built into the premise of the show, unless your name's Chris Underwood, because that's just bullshit. But anyway, her connections rob Sandra and TYSON, but she also has an interesting connection about another guy we're going to talk about called Yul Kwan. Her first season, the Cook Islands, that was divided by race, is actually the only season that's ever been won by an Asian American male. And he is a brilliant man who we'll talk about later on, but they have a relationship. I don't think that they've been incommunicado over the last 15 years, but they definitely know each other, and it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out. They're obviously on opposite tribes to start, so who knows if they'll even get to play together at any point, but I'm very interested to see how that goes. As far as her style goes, I guess I lied. I also listed Parvati as a hybrid. I thought it was just TYSON, but she was a follower her first time. She was a leader of sorts in her second time, but more so in her third time, so I couldn't really place her. I put her as a hybrid. She's an adaptive game player. Obviously, she has to be when she has such a huge target on her back, and people didn't seem to want to work with her in some scenarios. And then the one thing that is kind of her style, her adjective encapsulated, it sounds really bad because it's very reductive, but I gave myself the rule that I was only going to use one adjective, and I went with flirty, because that's what Jeff Probst always says. He says Parvati's the flirt, and in a way, he's kind of right. She's not necessarily a flirt in a sexual manner, but she has a very magnetic personality. She draws people in, men and women, and she is just very good at kind of batting her eyelashes, wiggling her hips, and getting people to do what she wants them to do. And it is a seductive thing that, I mean, if we could bottle it and sell it, you'd be a millionaire. But she's got it in spades, and she is, for that reason, a number 3 threat level. Moving on to this guy, Jeremy Clarkson. Oh. Well, that's a Freudian slip and a half. Oh god, I can't believe I put Jeremy Clarkson. That's amazing. Collins, not Clarkson, he did. So now we're moving on to this guy, Jeremy Collins. He is an interesting candidate here in this Survivor Winners at War. He's a relatively recent player. His first appearance was in 2014 in San Juan del Sur, when he finished in 10th place. He was blindsided by his alliance shortly after the merge, and tough luck, man. That kind of happens to a lot of people. He was a charismatic guy. He was very likable, and that's why he got voted out. And a lot of times, those players, you don't see him ever again. It happened to a lot of people, but he was fortunate in the sense that just a year later, we had a very unique Survivor concept season where, for the one and only time so far in Survivor history, we had the fans vote for who they wanted to be in the cast. And since he was obviously such a likable player, and his season was so recent, he was one of the 20 people picked for Survivor's Second Chances in Cambodia in 2015. Now, this is a very interesting case because he wins Survivor Cambodia in a landslide, a unanimous vote at the final tribal council, but he wasn't without danger. There was a moment at the final 6 where he had an immunity idol, he had the numbers, they were trying to vote out who was his biggest threat to win, a woman called Kelly Wentworth, and she plays her idol. And at that point, had he not had his idol and played it correctly, he would have gone home in 6th place and we would not be seeing him here this season. But he plays his idol, he does it really well. He votes out one of his own allies who actually turned on him. He thought they were his ally. And that ends up being the momentum that runs him to the end. But he wins the final immunity challenge, beating Kelly Wentworth, and once she's voted out, that seals it. He's going to win. He's a firefighter, he's a father of 2 children, one of whom was born, I think he actually might have 3 kids now. But his wife was pregnant when he went out to play Survivor, and he didn't tell anybody until the family visit when she came and told him that he was having a boy, and then he uses that at the final tribal council saying, guys, I've got a baby boy on the way, give me the money. And I mean, it was a slam dunk. He said he never wanted to play again, much like some other players who were, you know, they get their win, they get their $1 million and they move on. He said he never wanted to play again, but when a season like this comes around, those no's turn into yeses, and I'm very intrigued to see how he fares in this season. He has a connection to Natalie Anderson, who we'll talk about next, who won his original season in San Juan del Sur. They were alliance mates in that season. They were on the same tribe all the way through the pre-merge, I think, and then into the post-merge. After Jeremy gets voted out, Natalie goes on kind of a Kill Bill revenge streak that is really awesome to watch, and ends up bringing home the money for herself. 2 seasons later, Jeremy gets his $1 million as well. So seeing them both on this season and on the same tribe is going to be very interesting. His style, he's definitely a leader. It's the reason he was voted out in his first season, and it's the reason he won his second season. He's the front of the alliance, and it'll be interesting to see if he adapts that a little bit, because he's not going to be the big fish in a small pond. He might not even be the big fish in the big pond. He has a lot of wiggle room here. It's kind of difficult to pin him down. He's a big threat, but he's so charismatic and likable. He's so physically strong that you think people aren't going to want to vote him out right away, and the longer you let him stay in, the more chance he has to dig his heels in. So he's somebody who I struggle to place in this season. He's very charismatic. That's kind of the one that's the one word I came up with when thinking about his win on Survivor Cambodia. But he is also quite rigid. He got very upset when his alliance members turned on him in both seasons. Obviously in the second season he ends up winning the show, so he wasn't as upset, but he never seemed really willing to kind of cut off his alliance and go with a new one. So I would call him a more rigid player, and I put him at a 3 threat level. I think it might be more of a 2 now that I'm thinking about it comparatively, because not everybody can be a 3rd level threat, and I think the fact that there's so many other heavy hitters really helps him. So maybe he's a 2. He's somewhere in that range, but very excited to see Jeremy back. Natalie Anderson, we just mentioned her. She was originally on The Amazing Race. She was on with her twin sister, who she actually went on to Survivor with as well. San Juan del Sur was also a Blood vs. Water season. Her sister was voted out first, and that really opened up her game, allowed her to be a free agent in a way that a lot of other people weren't, because they had their loved ones still in the game. Jeremy also had his loved one, his wife, voted out second in that season. They bonded over that, and they had an alliance that could have gone the distance. But ultimately, Jeremy and Natalie were blindsided at the final 10, and when Jeremy went home, Natalie had a choice. She could either burn the place down and just say, screw it all, you guys suck, I hate you, or she could compartmentalize it, tell everybody it's okay, and then secretly make a plan to slit their throats. And that's exactly what she did. She took them all out systematically, one by one, and like I said before, it was Kill Bill. It was really impressive to see the way that she manipulated people. She got in good with the remaining couples in the game, severed the ties one by one, and ends up going to the final 3 with another couple of women, one of few all-female final 3s that we've had. And she wins, and it's almost a no contest. The only votes that she loses, really, are the ones that are cast by the loved ones of her opponents on the jury. So you were never going to get those, Natalie. But she plays a really impressive game, and one of the more surprisingly impressive games based on the assessment that we had on her based on her time in The Amazing Race and in the pre-season. Obviously, her connection is with Jeremy, and they are both starting on the same tribe. So it's going to be very interesting to see if they are targeted because of that, or if they take over because of that. Because there's a lot of other threats out there, and Natalie isn't that high of a threat. I've put her at a level 2 threat level. I think that she's got a very sneakily good chance in this game, because she isn't so red hot of a threat that people are gunning for her straight away, but she's also not so meek that people come for her straight away. She can hold her own in the challenges. She's going to be social and get in with a good group. She's got Jeremy already, so barring some unforeseen circumstances, I think she's in it for the long haul. She's a leader, most definitely. Her and Jeremy are both leaders in a weird way, so maybe there could be some kind of clash there, but I think they get along in a very compatriotic kind of way. She's an adaptive game player, as I mentioned. Her alliance was blindsided, she had to adapt, and she did a very good job of it. It'll be interesting to see if that changes based on how it goes for her this time. And her style, fiery. She scorched the earth. She really just came in with so much passion and verve for the game, especially after her sister and her best friend get voted out. And then she just takes over from that point. The momentum was incredible, and I'm very interested to see what she does in her second time out this season. Now we move on to probably my personal favorite get in this cast. It's a huge moment for me as a fan to see Yul Kwon back on Survivor. I mentioned him before. He played with PARVATI in Cook Islands back in 2006, the infamously racially divided tribes season, and he wins it for the Asian Americans. And he's not the only Asian American to win it, because Natalie, as we just mentioned, is from Sri Lanka, so she is also an Asian American. But he's the only male Asian American, specifically of East Asian descent, to ever win the show. And he's talked about in his interviews about how constrained and pressured he felt in that situation, because he felt he had to represent his race, his people, when he was on the screen. And that kind of pressure made him a little bit more withdrawn from the manipulation and the backstabbing. Not so much so that he wasn't able to go on and win the show, though. He ended up in a very interesting alliance where it was him, another Survivor legend, Aussie, and a couple of other women who were down in the numbers 8-4 at the merge, and managed to really just plow their way through the game after that. They were winning immunities. In fact, it was not 8-4 at the merge. It was 8-4 when they were still in tribes. But he won, I think he won a couple of immunities just with 4 people. And then when it was 6-4 at the merge, they managed to flip a guy over and then ran the gambit from there. And it was really impressive to see this guy who was so intelligent and well-spoken, but also withdrawn in the sense that he was very conscious of how he was being viewed, to see that guy go on and take the $1 million. He only won by 1 vote over Aussie, so to this day you still think could have gone either way. But that connection with PARVATI, and the fact that now he's coming into this season with the shackles off of him, and it's been such a long layoff, and although I'm sure he's watched Survivor, he hasn't been very present in the community. He's a real wild card. He's been gone long enough to where his status as a great winner is still there, but it's almost evolved into legend and myth. None of these players know him. Even PARVATI, who played with him, probably hasn't spoken to him in a very long time. So it's going to be interesting to see whether that works for him or against him, because not having those allegiances or those connections pre-game could be very detrimental if he gets on the wrong side of the numbers early, or it could really save his ass if he manages to be a free agent and to float through. And if there's anyone intelligent enough and smart enough and prepared enough to do it, it's this guy right here. Couldn't be more thrilled that we're going to see him this season. He is a leader, although I think that this season he might change that. I don't think he's going to be coming in trying to corral his numbers early on. I think he's going to try and join up with an alliance that's led by somebody else. Be a loyal vote, tell them everything they want to hear, and he's going to wait and pick his moment until later in the season. At least I think that's what he should do if he wants to have a chance at this. He's an adaptive game player. Obviously, I told you before, he was very much down in the numbers on his first season. He had one of the original immunity idols on the show that had slightly different powers, but he managed to play it to perfection. And the main word that I would use to describe him is strategic. He's probably the most intelligent guy out there. He's worked for Google and Facebook and the Obama administration at the FCC. This guy's got a resume that would put most people's to shame. And he's out here on Survivor, so he's a little bit of a fish out of water, but not in a bad way. And I think he's social enough, and I think he's intelligent enough to get this job done. We'll see how it goes. I put him at a threat level of 2. It would be a 3, but I think the fact that he doesn't have any connections really does hurt him a little bit. We've got another one of my favorites, Kim Spradlin. Now, Kim Spradlin Wolfe, who probably played the single most impressive season I've seen of Survivor. Now, she didn't win all the votes at the end, but the way that she took over the game from the beginning and just stayed the course, she masterminded the most successful women's alliance, in my opinion, in the history of the show. She was the figurehead of the alliance, and at no point did anyone really consider getting her out. She was never anywhere near in danger, and it's just because she was so damn likable. She played on Survivor One World, and afterwards, after winning her $1 million, She had 3 kids in like 2 years, and since then she's kind of been absent from the Survivor community, and it didn't seem like we were ever going to get to see her play again. By the sounds of it, she was asked back a few times and kept saying no because she had young kids, but again, season 40 turns no's into yeses, and it's amazing that we're going to see her play again. Now, the weird thing about Kim, she has no connections on this cast, at least not from her season. The weird thing about Kim is that she was almost so underrated that she's now overrated, and I don't mean that in a bad way. I don't think that she's overrated at all, but I think that people have clocked into her being as good as she is because people weren't doing it for so long. And I think the online community and, you know, the community of Survivor fans out there who really religiously watch the show have always touted her as such a great player. I think that over the years, now everybody kind of agrees, and I think that those players specifically in the game, they know exactly how good she is, and I think the big problem Kim might have is maybe she doesn't know that they know how good she is. Maybe she thinks she can slip under the radar, and she really can. So it's going to be interesting to see how she adapts her game. She's obviously a leader. She was a leader of, like I said, the most successful women's alliance in the history of the show. She's very adaptive. She managed, at least I think she is, based on what I can tell. She's very social. She never really had to adapt in her season, so I just didn't want to call her rigid because I don't see her as that type of player. But the reason that she was so good was because she was so damn likable, and that was the word that I came up with. She was likable to the point where nobody wanted to vote her out, even though they knew she was going to win the game. And at the end, nobody wanted to not give her the $1 million, except for maybe a couple of bitter betties on the jury who knew how good she was and just didn't want to give it to her. She's a 3 threat level. She could be down to a 2 just because she has only played the one time, but I think that that one time was so damn good. I think that people are going to really be onto her fast. I just hope that she's as good as I think she is and that she can find a way to get the job done here. And here is another personal favorite of mine. They're coming at me thick and fast. Ethan ZOHN. Now, he is one of the oldest survivors out there, both in terms of age and also how long ago he played. Just like Amber, he hasn't played since Survivor All-Stars, and his first season was back in 2001. He won his first season, however, which is different from Amber, and he won it in really nice fashion, if that makes sense. He did it as the nice guy. He was the first truly just good all-around guy to win the show. Obviously, it was only the 3rd season, but you didn't often, and you still don't often see somebody who can get through the game without doing anything wrong to anybody and still win at the very end. He was so likable, and he comes back for Survivor All-Stars and never stands a chance because the winners in that season were targeted very early on by the rest of the players, and he ended up being the last winner standing, so there's something to be said for that. But the thing about Ethan that makes him so much more likable than he already is his story. He started a charity called Grassroots Soccer right after he finished his first season of Survivor, and he has now to this day raised over $80 million, I think, for Grassroots Soccer, which is an astounding amount of money. But he also had 2 really harrowing battles with cancer. He had, I think it was Hodgkin's lymphoma. He had it shortly after Survivor All-Stars, I believe, for the first time. He beat it. It came back again, and the second time it really did seem like his days were numbered. And I think he's got that attitude now of every day is a gift, and the fact that he's even out there is so great to him. I think he's going to swing for the fences and he's going to go for it. And I don't think that he's a high-level threat. I've put him down as a level 1 threat because he played so long ago and has had such a turbulent last few years with his battle with cancer and the fact that he's been, you know, flying all over the place promoting his charity, and he's such a nice guy. I don't get the impression that people are going to look at him as a conniving strategist or someone they need to worry about until maybe it's too late. So I actually have a very good feeling that Ethan is going to be around for a long time, and I think he could win this whole thing. He's more of a follower, which is something that I don't think he would take offense to. He was kind of the number 2 to his guy Lex in his first season, and I think he would kind of slip into that role again this season. I think he'll be more of a partner than a follower, but I don't think he's the type of player who's going to try and wrangle numbers and lead the charge in any particular direction. I think he's going to go with the flow, and he's going to do what's best for his game. He's very adaptive, like I said, although I would say he never had to adapt in his first season. He did a very good job of avoiding getting voted out longer than any other winner in his second season, despite huge targets being on their back. So I think he can play a very adaptive game, and the reason that he won was because he's so friendly. He's a nice guy, he's funny, he's enjoyable to be around, and he's got a great story. And I think all of those reasons are reasons that he's going to be in the game for a very long time. Sarah LACINA. Now, I'm not the biggest Sarah LACINA fan. She played in Survivor Cagayan back in 2014, and she got blindsided at the merge because mostly due to her own doing. She was a swing vote, and she overplayed her hand and ended up getting booted out of the game. She was kind of bitter about it, which I'd never really liked to see. And then she came back for Survivor Game Changers, and I was open to seeing her back on the show, but I didn't really want to see her win, especially because I find her personality to be very dry. She's not that funny, you know, she's not that enjoyable to watch, although I will give it to her, she played a very impressive game in Game Changers. I think it was almost too impressive. I don't think anyone is going to sleep on Sarah LACINA this time. Her connections, she played with Sandra in Game Changers. She obviously won that season. The only season that Sandra has been on and not won is won by this girl. I don't think Sandra's going to like that. I think, considering they're on the same tribe to begin with, I do not think they're going to be aligned. And she also played with Tony, who's an amazing character that we'll get to later on. She's another hybrid. She's not really a follower, but I wouldn't call her a leader either. She's a snake in the grass. She's very cunning, and I think that she definitely has what it takes, but I don't know if she's going to come in the right mindset for this game. I think that she might get out early. In fact, I think she's going to be the first boot. That's my hot take, is I think she's going to be the first one voted out, or at least the first one voted out of her tribe, assuming they go to tribal council in the first couple of episodes, because she's a bit rigid, and I think that she believes her own hype. Now, this all could be proved wrong. I've given her a threat level of 2, but I think it might be perceived higher than that by the other players in the game. And I just don't think she's long for this one. I don't get good feeling about Sarah in this game. But hey, if she ends up playing another great game and goes all the way, hats off to her. She's just not really my cup of tea. And speak of the devil, or speak of the llama. That's a joke that, you know, you wouldn't get if you hadn't seen the season. But yeah, it's pretty funny, I promise. Tony VLACHOS. He's a guy who really pioneered this, maybe not this latest era of Survivor, but the era directly before that, where he played a frenetic game. That's the adjective I use to describe it. It was all over the place. It was dominant, but it was just so damn crazy. And nothing we have ever seen before or since will compare to that game that he played on Survivor Cagayan with Sarah. He and Sarah are both police officers, and he lied to her about it and told her that he was in construction. She knew he was lying, so he then copped to it. Great pun, thank you. And at that point, he just kind of went on this mad run through the game where he was finding idols, playing idols incorrectly. He was on the wrong side of the numbers, on the right side of the numbers. But it wasn't really until about the finals 8 or 7, when his numbers had firmly taken over the game, then he started cutting throats. He cut all of his threats as he went down, and he did it systematically. And the most impressive thing he did, at the final 4, he had an immunity idol that was useless because you can't play immunity idols at the final 4, but he convinced everybody that it still was going to work, and everybody believed him, and they didn't vote him out. And then he ends up going to the final 3, where there's a final immunity challenge. Very rare that we get a final 2 nowadays, but there's a final immunity, and he doesn't win it. He doesn't get close. And so at that point, the obvious thing for the 2 people that he was playing with would be to vote him out. He was obviously the biggest threat to win, but what does he do? He convinces Wu, albeit gullible surfer dude kind of guy, who wins the immunity. He convinces Wu to vote out who is probably the easiest person to win against in Survivor, this woman called Cass, who was very unlikable by the cast on that season. And he convinces Wu to vote her out and take him to the end, where he gets blown out 8-0. It was one of the most baffling things I've ever seen, and it's easy to say that Wu was an idiot, because he was, but there's something to say for the fact that Tony managed to convince him of that. Now, he comes back in Game Changers, he flames out immediately, he goes in way too hard too fast, gets himself on the wrong side of the numbers, and boom, he's done. And he just does it in such a disappointing way for somebody who was so entertaining in his first time out, but what are you going to do at the end of the day? But I think that really checked his ego. I think he's at a point now where he's ready to come back and take it easy, and I think that's what he's going to have to do. But despite all of that, the fact that he's a leader of people, I don't think he's going to really be able to take a back seat, even though he's going to have to try. And he's so rigid about the way that he has to do things. He's adaptive, but not in a way that allows him to go with somebody else's plans. He's going to have to be in charge of who's going home and when. He's 3 threat level. I want to believe that he's going to do well, but unfortunately I don't think he's going to make it much further than he did in Game Changers. Alright, we're getting there now. Danny Boatwright, probably the least well-known of all of the winners, at least by the fact that it's been 15 years since she played. She only played once on a season that no players have ever returned from. So her being the winner of a season that no one else has returned from in 15 years and her coming back, it's pretty cool for a Survivor nerd like to see Danny here. She's a sports journalist of some kind. She's not really been in the Survivor community, although I do get the impression that she's watched the show. She obviously has no connections because no one from that season ever comes back. But she's a very unique kind of player because she didn't really even tell production what she was doing. She didn't go into her confessionals and say, oh, I'm aligned with this person and I'm doing this and I'm doing that. She kind of kept it from everybody and kept playing her game as subtly and below the radar as possible, and it worked perfectly. But because it was so under the radar, it's kind of unheralded. There wasn't a lot to show because she wouldn't tell the cameras what she was doing. Although after the fact, she would go and do interviews where she would kind of lay out what she was thinking, and who knows how much of that was going on at the time and how much of that she retconned afterwards. But she's a very shrewd player. She's a lot older now, but I mean, hey, she still looks good. She's still ready to go, and I think that she's going to be a very interesting kind of surprise package in this season. I think she's going to get overlooked. She's definitely a level 1 threat level. Nobody's worried about her. She's a follower, she's adaptive, and she's very subtle, and those three things combined could either make her the obvious choice to win the season because people will just be shooting, daggers at each other over the top of her head while she just waits for her moment, or it could make her somebody who is targeted early for being, kind of just an also-ran who people don't really want to even associate with. Or, and I think this is the most likely scenario, I think she's somebody who's probably going to get to the very end, but I don't think she's going to win. I don't think she would have to do something very out of character and very over the top in order to impress a jury of her fellow peers in this game. But we'll see. I'm excited to see her back. I'm excited to see Survivor Guatemala get some representation on this season. And now we're getting into some of the more recent winners. I'm going to go quicker through these because my friends have seen him. And this is a guy that none of us really like. He seems like a decent bloke, but he's just not that fun to watch, in my opinion. I think he's a little bit one-dimensional. He's a big guy. He finds idols. He obviously has a decent social game, but I didn't really enjoy watching him win his season. It's not a knock on him. I'm sure he's a decent bloke. He seems like a nice guy, but there's just something about him that makes me go, meh, just not my thing. Kind of like Sarah, didn't entertain me, and I'm all for being proved wrong and being won over. If he goes on a tear this season and ends up showing everybody a thing or two, I'll probably start to like him. I don't know if he's going to do that. I think he's got Merge Boot written all over him, somebody who people aren't too worried about to get out early on, but somebody who nobody's going to let get too close to the end just because of how physical he is in his track record for finding immunity idols every damn day and making the game so boring because you can never vote him out. Anyway, that's kind of going off on one. He's definitely a leader, although he was definitely out of the numbers for most of his season, which is why he had to keep finding immunity idols, and that's why I would kind of describe him as just dogged. Like, he's determined, and he just wouldn't take no for an answer at every stage where it looked like he was out of the game. They were sure he was going to get voted out. He would find an idol. He would get lucky with a Final Four fire-making challenge out of nowhere, but at the end of the day, finding idols and having chances to win is not guaranteeing you anything, and he managed to take those opportunities, so I do give credit to him for playing the best game he could in his situation and for winning the game. But it'd be interesting to see how he does in a bigger pond, because this time he's not going to have such a big target on his back. So I think we're going to see a lot more of his social game. We might get to see him actually make some good alliances, but he's also a guy who I could see making some minority alliances, shall we say. Somebody who's going to get into the wrong side of the numbers and maybe just get picked off from there. I don't know how adaptable he really is. I've given him a threat level of 2 just because he's a recent winner. He played a very flashy game in the sense that he found idols and won a lot of challenges, and that's something that the further along in the game you get, people are not going to have any time or patience for. Sophie Clarke. Now, this is another interesting one. She was 21 years old when she won Survivor South Pacific. She actually beat a 3-time player in one of those captain seasons where you have 2 returning players and then the rest of the cast are new. The season directly before hers was won by Boston Rob in a blowout. It was never even close. But she goes to the end with one of the returning players, Coach, in that season, and she beats him. She doesn't blow him out, but she beats him, and she beats him comfortably. As a 21-year-old, it was very impressive to watch Sophie kind of get under Coach's coattail a little bit and kind of grab onto it, but also separate herself from it enough to where people knew she was playing her own game, and she managed to subtly sabotage him and make herself look good in a lot of different ways. She doesn't have any connections in the sense that she doesn't have anybody from her season. She's only played that one time, and obviously only the winner is eligible to come back. So she is going into this probably a little blind, but I get the impression that she's probably friends with some of these people outside of the game. She's definitely a follower, but I think that could change. I think she was a follower to coach, and I think that she could try and, you know, imitate that same style of game, especially if somebody like a Boston Rob or a Tyson or a Jeremy or a Tony, if one of those types of people comes to her for an alliance, she's not saying no, and I could see her try and execute the same thing over again. She's adaptive, obviously. She was in the majority alliance for most of her season, but she had to adapt to get to a point where she could win, because if you're going to grab on somebody's coattails and let them go out in front, and you're going to go to the end with that person, you've got to be building your resume in the background in a very careful way to where your alliance partner doesn't think you're a threat to beat them, but the jury actually does, and that's a very fine line that she, you know, rode very well throughout her season. I think she won because she was placative, which is ironic because she, from all I can tell, she's actually quite a brusque and straight to the point New Yorker type of person. I don't know if she's actually from New York, but she kind of seems like a very intellectual, very intelligent person who doesn't have time for anyone's bullshit. So the fact that she managed to placate a guy like Coach, who, for anybody who knows who he is, was the master of bullshit and just total erroneous details of things that never happened, that somebody like Sophie, I feel like, would have no patience for, and yet she stuck with him for 39 days and beat him in the end. So I think she has that thing about her. And she's a level 1 threat level, because it's been a long while since she played. It's been 9 years. People have definitely forgotten about her. I think some of these winners will remember her, but I don't think anybody's coming for her. I think that she would have to really get unlucky and get on the wrong side of the numbers, either off the bat or after the merge, or she would have to do something that backfires massively. I feel like she's going to go deep into the game. Whether she can pull off another victory remains to be seen. I'm pretty high on Sophie this season. Wendell Holland, another more recent winner I'm not going to spend too much time on. He is notable for having won the only final tribal council that ended in a tie. So in that way, he's actually the least qualified to be here, which is, you know, kind of tongue-in-cheek, because obviously he played a great game to get that far and to ultimately win on the tiebreaker. He won only 2 years ago, so he's definitely going to be front of mind for some people. He's a leader, but he's more rigid. He definitely has his way of doing things, and I feel like he's going to look for a partner like he had last time in Dominic, and he's going to try and run it out. He's cooperative, like I said, with a guy like Dominic, so if he can find somebody to bounce ideas off of, somebody to trust, I think he could do well, but I'm not sure that anybody is going to play that kind of game. So he's going to either have to switch his game up, or he's going to have to be prepared for the fact that he's not going to find somebody like Dominic on this season. I've given him a threat level of 2 because he is a recent winner, and he is a very personable guy. He seems like he's a very capable Survivor player. I just personally think he might be in a little over his head here. He would be fortunate to go deep into this game, but hey, I'm happy to be proven wrong. I like the guy. I'm interested. Michele FITZGERALD. Now, for my friends who I mentioned at the start of this, this was the first Survivor winner they saw, and my friends weren't big fans of Aubrey, so they were pretty okay with seeing Michele win. I think that she's got a chip on her shoulder this season. She won Survivor Co-Wrong 4 years ago, and not a lot of people talk about it. People kind of mention Aubrey, who she beat in the final Tribal Council, and who has returned twice on her own merit since then, and they kind of remember her as the figurehead of the season, not the girl who actually won the show. And she won because she was affable, she was very likable, and she never really was front of mind for anybody to vote out. And once she got to the end, she argued her case extremely well as to why she deserved to win over Aubrey, who played a very strong strategic game. I think that she's got a chip on her shoulder because of all of that hype around Aubrey's game, who, you know, she's sitting here thinking, I've won the game, and then this girl who I beat at the end is getting invited back twice in the next few years, and I've never really even mentioned. So I think she's going out there with something to prove, but it remains to be seen whether she's going to change her game because of it. She's a follower, she's adaptive, and she's affable. She's a very much in the Danny BOATWRIGHT kind of school of winners, which is not to say anything negative, because those are the type of people who obviously win the game fairly regularly. But in the modern day of Survivor, she's kind of an outlier. In the modern day, a lot of guys win, a lot of big, flashy, idol-playing, muscular dudes who dominate challenges and dominate the game and just kind of force the game into submission are the types of players who win nowadays. But this season is totally unlike normal seasons where it's all strangers. So I think that this season could be the type of season where Michele could do what Amber did in All-Stars, what Sandra did in Heroes vs. Villains, what Sarah did in Game Changers, come in with not much of a target on your back and slowly build momentum. So it'll be interesting to see how it goes. She's a threat level of 1. I think that helps her. Adam Klein. What a likable guy. I think him and Ethan will get along. He had a very emotional story about his mother who sadly passed away from cancer the day that he got back from winning Survivor. And that was one of the more emotional moments that my friends and I had watching Survivor just a few years ago. It's great to see him back because he's another one who is very young. He's a huge Survivor fan, so he'll be geeking to be here. He'll be absolutely beside himself that he's playing with all of these players. And it remains to be seen whether that'll get the best out of him or whether that'll just have him starstruck out of the game very early on. I think he's in a weird spot because I think that he's the type of player that could slip under the radar unless people start to get a little meta with it and start to think, okay, let's pick off these players under the radar, and they lift that radar up right off the bat. I could see him being in trouble there. But he's very nice, he's very sociable, and like I said, I could see him getting along with somebody like Ethan, who has a lot of shared experiences with Adam relating to cancer, and I think that he could do very well, but I don't see him winning the game. I don't see him building up enough of a resume and enough momentum to win, but I think he'll be around for a little while. At least that's my level. He's another threat level 1 kind of player. He's a follower, he's adaptive, and he's very sympathetic. He's somebody you want to root for, and even though you're playing a game against somebody like that, he's not somebody that you're going to take any joy out of voting out, and I think that that's something that could give him some staying power here. Denise Stapley. Now, this is another one, a one-time player from the middle 20 seasons who kind of got overlooked. She was on another season with team captains. They had 3 returning players on 3 tribes that season, and again, she ends up beating one of them in the final 3. She does a very impressive job in this game of listening. She's a licensed sex therapist, so she obviously hears all sorts of things in her day-to-day life and was very good at talking to all different types of people. She made a very unusual alliance with a young man called Malcolm, and they ran the gambit. They were the last 2 people left on their original tribe, and despite getting split up, and despite Denise going to every single tribal council throughout the season, the only player to ever do that and win the game, she ends up winning the game. And at the final 4 immunity, when Malcolm falls just a little bit short as he had been the hot favorite to win, she cuts his throat and she ends up taking home the $1 million. She's somebody who is a little bit older, but still, you know, fit enough, I think, to hang with all of these people, especially because this is one of the oldest casts in Survivor history. And I think that she's another one who is undersold in the sense that her game isn't that well known, and I think a lot of players are going to forget about her, and that could be to her benefit. She's a follower, she's adaptive, and ultimately she's compassionate. She's very good at listening to people and understanding their problems and talking through them as a therapist, and I think that that's the kind of skill set that can serve her well even on a season with all winners like this, because everybody is still going to be starving, is still going to be miserable in the rain, and she's the type of person who can keep a cool head and keep everybody's spirits up in that situation. She's a threat level of 1, and as I've said about a lot of these threat level 1 people, that could be a very good thing in such a big fish kind of season. Nick Wilson. Now, he's the most recent winner out here. He's a young man, he's a lawyer, and he won David versus Goliath. He was another guy who I liked, but I wasn't crazy about. I didn't think he did anything too spectacular in his game. I still kind of think Mike White should have won that season. I think that the fact that Mike is kind of a semi-celebrity who's been in movies and probably has a little bit of money kind of helps the fact that Nick ended up winning the season, but that's not to take anything away from Nick. He played a good game. He just didn't do anything too flashy, but normally for other people who have played earlier in the season or earlier in time, the fact that you're an undersold winner is good, you know, for Danny and Denise and Sophie and players like that. But for Nick, the fact that he's so recent, I think it works against him, because I think he's going to come out here with a point to prove. He's going to want to come out here and show everybody what he's got, and I think that could backfire on him hugely. I don't think that Nick is going to be long for this game at all. He's a follower, he's adaptive, and he's understated in the sense that he kind of got by as being this good old boy who didn't know too much, but no one really knew he was a lawyer and was very well educated. Everybody knows that now. Everybody knows he's won his game, so he's going to have to switch some things up. And if he switches things up too drastically, that could get him out of here real quick. I've put him at a threat level of 1, not so much because people aren't threatened by him, but because I really just don't think he has any shot in a game of this size. And with that being said, thank you for sticking with me. I know it was a long one. I'm rambling. But I've managed to make it through all 20 of Survivor's winners at war for this season. My final thoughts. I've gone with Sarah LACINA as my first boot. I think that she's just going to come in with a little bit too much of a target and a little bit too much ego, and I think that combo is going to take her out. And as far as a winner pick, I've thought about it long and hard. I think that it's coming down to two people for me, and it's both coming from the heart. It's Kim and it's Ethan. Overall, I think I'm going to go with Ethan because that's who I want to win the most. He has got a wonderful story, he's a wonderful guy, and it would be such a great way to kind of celebrate this season to have someone so likable to win. But to be honest, there's not many people who I would be upset if they won. I would love Yul to play well and win. I would love Ethan and Kim to play well and win. I'd love Denise to win, Danny, Tony, any of them really, as long as they're not Ben or Nick or... yeah, maybe not anybody, but overall I think that I've done a fairly decent job of giving you a quick overview of everybody, and I know quick is kind of ironic in a video of this length, but thank you for watching and enjoy Survivor this season.